Testing, testing. Test. Testing. 1, 2, 3. There we go. I think we got it now. Hello, everyone. How's it going? Can you hear me? Testing. 1, 2, 3. I think my mic was off. All right. Excellent. So today we're going to do a little bit of a dive into Leviticus, and I want to treat this as a little bit more of a commentary, if you will. And the idea would be to try and see how far through the book of Leviticus we can actually get, and then perhaps stop every once in a while on certain chapters, and we can just kind of go through this together. And then if there's any questions or whatever, something that jumps out at you and maybe you haven't seen before, maybe share in the comments when's the last time that you read the book of Leviticus. I think it's just important every once in a while to actually sit back, relax a little bit, and be able to look at a book in the Bible, and then go, okay, what's going on here? What is being communicated here? Because sometimes we just kind of just blow through verses, or we skip over books, and we're just like, yeah, I don't want to get into all these sacrifices and all this kind of stuff. So I understand that. I get that. I used to be like that as well. So I want to be able to present this in a way that might be a little bit interesting to you, as obviously it was important to Moses to write this down, and maybe just share some ideas, some thoughts, some things that I think about when I'm reading the book of Leviticus. Again, we are in modern times. Obviously, we don't go out and sacrifice animals for our sins. If we offend our neighbor, we don't give him 5 oxen or whatever it is. We just don't do that. So I think this is perhaps one of the reasons why people just kind of skip over Leviticus, and then we go back to maybe Ruth, and then maybe we dive into the book of Acts, a couple of the Gospels, and maybe wrap things up with some Romans or Corinthians, and then that's it. Call it a year. And I think we just do that year after year, and we just loop it. At least that's how I used to do it. I used to perhaps once in a while I would read the book of Proverbs once in a while. I'd read all 30 chapters. I'd try and do it for like a month, and then I would stop reading my Bible for weeks, months, and just a verse here and there, and that's it. So what I want to be able to present with this little biblical series is the idea to be able to, once you start reading a book, just finish that book. So if you start reading Leviticus, finish reading it. If you start Genesis, finish reading it before you jump onto another book. And eventually you're going to get through the entire Bible, and it's going to be a blessing. So let's just jump into, I'm going to share my screen using Bible Gateway, King James Version. So we're just going to have a look at Leviticus chapter 1, and we'll just go from there. All right. So let's jump into Leviticus chapter 1. All right. Leviticus 1. So hopefully you can see your screen. Hopefully you can see my screen here. Takes a little bit of getting used to. I'm using my wife's Air Pro. So let me see if I can make this full screen. All right, there we go. On my computer, it's pretty straightforward. I'd like to make this full screen. Oh well. All right. So this is Leviticus chapter 1. So this is written approximately when Israel had just left Egypt. This is probably like year 1 inside year 2. And Moses is at Mount Sinai, and basically Israel said, you speak to God for us on our behalf, and then whatever he says to you, we will do. So this is basically how we get Leviticus. So let's just go through a couple of verses here, and then we'll talk about it. So, and the Lord called unto Moses, and spake unto him out of the tabernacle of the congregation, saying, speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, if any man of you bring an offering unto the Lord, ye shall bring your offering of the cattle, even of the herd, and of the flock. And if his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let us go back to the screen. If his offering be a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish, and he shall offer it of his own voluntary will at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord. And he shall put his hand upon the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make an atonement for him. So we'll stop there, and then let's just talk about what's going on here. Let's have a little conversation, shall we? All right. So we have Moses writing Leviticus, and God spoke to him out of the tabernacle. The idea was the ark would get set up, and God would speak to Moses out of the ark, because you have the cherubim above the ark, and eventually you'll have the 10 commandments that are inside the ark, and this is how God would speak to Moses, almost like a radio, if you will. And perhaps we'll get into that. I'm trying to think where that was. I think it's in Exodus where this all gets set up. So the idea again here is teach the children of Israel, if any of you bring an offering unto the Lord. So cattle, what is cattle? Cattle is of the herd and the flock. So basically we're talking about rams, we're talking about sheep, and we're talking about bulls, all that kind of stuff, different types of species. So it's not just cattle, if you will. Cattle is just a generic term for types of animals that they raised. So again, we're talking bulls, we're talking cows, we're talking rams, we're talking basically sheep. And so whenever we talk about sacrifices, it's usually into one of these 3, maybe 4 categories, where you got rams and lambs, you got bulls, you got cows, which are the female, and then you also have goats. So you got male and female goats, and then you also have fowls, different types of fowls. So that's basically, those are the type of animals that they're not sacrificing camels, they're not sacrificing ostriches or anything like that, but basically these are, whenever you see cattle, basically this includes all of these various categories. And I want to go down to verse 3, where if his offering be a burnt offering of a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own voluntary will at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord. So this is basically on a volunteer basis, which is kind of interesting, right? And then we see that how they're to kill the bullock before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's son, shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood round about upon the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of the congregation, and he shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. And the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire upon the altar and lay the wood in order upon the fire. And the priests and Aaron's sons shall lay the parts, the head, the fat, in order upon the wood that is on the fire, which is upon the altar. And I'll just talk about this a little. I'm going to go back and forth between reading it and then sharing my thoughts. Because if you want to read along, you can read along with your Bible. But the idea here is, this is where people start going, well, this is starting to get a little bit too bloody for me, because now we're getting animals that are being sacrificed. And the idea behind this is, it's better the animals than you, like, really. And if you want to be around a God that is holy, this is the deal. If you don't, then you can go back to Egypt. But the idea is to be able to create a sacrificial system, if you will, that will allow people to be able to function in society and to be able to get along and all this kind of stuff. So you can almost look at this as a transactional relationship, if you will, where if people have animals, that they would freely give these animals to be sacrificed as an atonement. And obviously today, if you tie this in today, what Jesus Christ did for us on the cross, he basically washed away our sins once and for all. And he also did something a little bit different than what you couldn't do in the Old Testament with the sacrificial system. And that is, he purged our consciences, our conscience, if you will. Meaning, back in the old days, in the Old Testament, if you stole from your neighbor, let's say you stole a bull, and your neighbor finds out, hey, this person stole a bull, and you get caught, and you're like, sorry about that. I humbly apologize. I stole your bull. How can I fix this mess? And the deal is, I believe it's here in Leviticus, and perhaps we'll come across it, that you would give like 5 bulls, because you're a thief, and you give him 5 bulls. So he comes out ahead, and basically the deal is done. You offer some animals to get sacrificed so that you get forgiven as well by the Lord, and you move on. But let's just say perhaps the next day you're out in the field working with your animals, and you see that neighbor that you stole from. He may not have a working relationship with you anymore. Why? Because you stole from him, even though you restored the 5 bulls. And you might lie awake at night going, man, even though I gave 5 of my bulls, I still feel horrible for what I did. I feel horrible for what I did to my neighbor. And this is the thing that would most likely happen, is even though you get restored, you can actually participate with the camp, your conscience still hasn't been cleared. And so if the priest would come in and atone for your sins once a year in the most holy of holies, you're still wrestling with stuff in your head. Maybe you stole, maybe you committed some sin that was unintentional, whatever it is. And then when it came to your memory, all of a sudden you're like, oh man, I got to sacrifice one of these animals, because now I remember that I did something wrong. So that's kind of the idea behind it in the Old Testament. And today, obviously, when you are going about your day, we have God's laws written on our hearts. We're circumcised. We have our hearts that are circumcised. And when we realize that we've done something wrong, usually what we do is we confess that to another person. And hopefully you restore the relationship and make up for it. If you did something to them, you try and figure out a way to restore that relationship. But your conscience is actually cleared, because you actually asked for forgiveness from the Lord, and you went to that person and you said, will you forgive me? I know I offended you. I said something, or I did something, and will you please forgive me? And they're like, yeah, it's water under the bridge. And then you move on. A little bit different in the Old Testament because, again, the priest wasn't able to wash away their conscience, but they were able to function as a society. And I think that's the way that you kind of have to approach Leviticus, is you have to look at it from the point of view of this is the template as to how you create a nation out of from scratch. Meaning they were in Egypt for 430 years under bondage, whether that meant they were in debt, financial duress, whatever. They couldn't just as a whole family pack up their bags and leave. They were stuck there. And it wasn't like that at the beginning. They were able to freely go wherever they wanted, including Joseph. Joseph was a free man. He was set free when he became second in command, but he chose to stay there and he chose to help out Egypt. So then you get Israel, who at the very beginning had a ton of favor for the first few hundred years, if you will, and everything they touched was blessed. And you basically have the Egyptians, you have the Israelites, and over a period of 430 years, that favor starts to go away, and the Egyptians start to get jealous and envious of the Israelites because everything they touch is working, especially in the land of Goshen. So you get a group of people coming out of being influenced by the Egyptians. Now you have to create a little bit of a separation because the land that they're going into has been practicing all kinds of crazy stuff. We're talking child sacrifice. We're talking burying their firstborn as a dedication into their foundation of their homes, eating each other, practicing incest with each other, worshiping just about every god under the sun. And stealing from each other, everything that is mentioned in Leviticus. This is what the Canaanites were doing, the Amorites, if you will, and all the various nations that were within that land. This is what they were doing. This was a normal practice. So God basically created these rules to show Israel, this is what this nation did, and you're not supposed to be like them, because I'm making you a special generation, a peculiar generation, if you will, a nation that would stand out, so that when other nations would look at you, they would go, wow, God actually lives among you, the God of the universe. So yeah, so it's kind of interesting that this is what's happening in Leviticus, is you can actually use this template and look at it and go, clearly God is creating a new nation, basically using the people coming out of Egypt and creating a template, if you will. This is how you work with each other. This is how you work your crops. This is what you do after 6 years of working your crops. This is what you do if you have a slave, if you will. After 6 years, you let that person go. They are free to go. And if a stranger comes into your land, you don't vex him. Why? Because you were a stranger at one time. So you are to treat them like they are. You use the same rules as for your people as with the stranger. So it's just kind of interesting. All right, so we have a comment. Joseph of Arimathea. So that's just like 3 words. Are you asking a question, brother, or what are you where are you going with that? Let's just continue. I'm going to go back to Leviticus. I'm going to go back to Leviticus chapter 1. Let's go here. All right. So let's continue on. Shall kill it on the side of the altar northward before the Lord, and the priests and the sons shall sprinkle blood around about the altar, and he shall cut it into pieces, his head and his fat, and the priest shall lay them in order on the wood that is on the fire, which is upon the altar. But he shall wash the inwards and the legs with water, and the priest shall bring it all and burn it upon the altar. It is a burnt sacrifice, an offer made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. And you're going to see this come up again and again in the book of Leviticus. And if the burnt sacrifice for his offering to the Lord be of fowls, then he shall bring his offering of turtle doves and young pigeons. And the priest shall bring it unto the altar and wring off its head and burn it on the altar, and the blood thereof shall be wrung out at the side of the altar. Shall plug away his crop, and then we'll just skip down. And he shall cleave it with the wings thereof, but he shall not divide it under. I'm just going to skip over to chapter 2. And then, so that was the sacrifice. So now we're going to meat offering, which is basically using fine flour, pouring oil on it, and frankincense. So this is what they call a meat offering. So we'll just dive down. So basically, this is just how it all works out. I want to get to some of the thoughts behind this here. So you have the meat offering. Then we go into peace offerings. If he offered of the herd, whether it be a male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. And he shall lay his hand upon the head of his offering, kill it at the door of the tabernacle. So then it goes into 2 kidneys, the fat that is on them, which is by the flanks, and the caul above the liver, and the kidneys shall he take away, which is kind of interesting. So the thing that ends up on the fire is all the fat and everything else. But the flanks, the gall, the liver, all that stuff is taken away, which is kind of interesting because later, a few chapters down the road, we see the opposite of this happen, where actually the fat gets removed, the skin gets removed, and everything else gets burnt, including the head, the body, the innards, all kinds of stuff. So there's something going on here. And we'll talk about that perhaps in another video as to why some of this stuff is going on. All right, so we're talking about lamb offering. I want to get into, let's go down. Let's go here because there's lots of sacrifices going on here. All right. So look at this. Speak unto the children of Israel, saying, if a soul shall sin through ignorance against any of the commandments of the Lord concerning the things which ought not to be done, and shall do against any of them, if the priest that is anointed do sin according to the sin of the people, then let him bring for his sin which he has sinned a young bullock without blemish unto the Lord for a sin offering. And he shall bring the bullock to the door of the tabernacle of the congregation before the Lord, and lay his hand upon the bullock and killed it. So this is basically a bull that they're using to sacrifice if the priest sins. And this is, again, this is what's different than what Christ did for us, because he knew no sin. But here we have the priest actually doing something. He's using the bullocks to bring to sacrifice on behalf of his sin. And then we see 2 kidneys, fat that is upon them, which is by the flanks, the gall, and the kidneys, if it shall he take away. And it's taken off the bullock of the sacrifice of peace offerings. So the peace offerings here is for the priest to do this with the bullock. And the skin of the bullock and all his flesh, with his head and with his legs and with his inwards and his dung, even the whole bullock shall he carry forth without the camp. And this is what I was talking about. So he's taken everything, the legs, the inwards, his dung, everything, and putting it out into outside the camp where the ashes are poured out, and burn him on the wood with fire, and their ashes poured out shall he be burnt. And if the whole congregation sin through ignorance, and the thing be hid from the eyes of the assembly, and they have done somewhat against any of the commandments of the Lord concerning the things which should not be done, and are guilty, when the sin which they have sinned against it is known, the congregation shall offer a young bullock for the sin, and bring him before the tabernacle of the congregation upon the head of the bullock before the Lord, and the bullock shall be killed before the Lord. So it's interesting, right? And then you get into dipping his fingers into the blood and sprinkling it before the tabernacle of the congregation, and he shall take all his fat from him and burn it upon the altar. So remember, all the innards and everything is basically being burnt to a crisp and taken and dumped outside the camp. But the fat here is upon the altar, and this is basically the opposite of what people do. Basically the opposite of what some of the other offerings, I should say, are. So it's interesting, right? All right, let's come back to the comments here. No, the Joseph I was talking about was Joseph from Egypt, when he, one of the sons of Jacob, when he was sold to the Ishmaelites. One second here. So just a little definition that I wanted to type in here, what a bullock means. So bullock typically refers to a young bull or a male cow. The term bullock is used in various versions throughout the Old Testament. Here are a few examples. Thou shalt cause a bullock to be brought forth, tabernacle, and then in Leviticus, if a priest is anointed to do sin according to the sin, let him bring a young bullock. And then in Numbers, we get bullock mentioned as well. So in modern English, bullock is an older term for a young bull, but is less commonly used in the contemporary language. In King James and similar translations, the term bullock is retained to maintain the historical and traditional language of the text. So when we're talking about a bullock, we're talking about a young bull versus a bull, because later we're going to see those type of sacrifices as well. So yeah, with regards to Joseph, he was sold by the Ishmaelites to Potiphar, and then Potiphar put him in charge of everything in his house except for his wife. And then his wife obviously developed a bit of a crush on Joseph, to the point where she accused him of raping her. And what's interesting, and we'll get into this a little bit later, but rape in the Old Testament, the category of rape would be if you have a man that goes out into a field and sees a woman and he forces himself upon her, because usually men are stronger than women, and she screams out, then that man is to be put to death. Why? Because it's rape. It's rape. So that man is to be sentenced to death by stoning, not her. Why? Because she screamed. So in the case of Joseph, she screamed and he fled. Therefore, Joseph is basically being accused of rape. Now, he wasn't executed, but he was put in a prison that was usually all of Pharaoh's prisoners, if you will, the people that actually served under Pharaoh were put in this prison. So he didn't get killed. So sometimes I think about the idea that perhaps Potiphar knew what his wife was like, and she didn't scream until he left. And maybe this is something that she was on record of doing before. Maybe she slept with other people. Don't know. But we know that Joseph wasn't killed. And a lot of the capital punishment style, if you will, came out of Egypt. The stoning came from Egypt. It wasn't invented by the Israelites. So, for example, when Moses was saying to Pharaoh, let my people go, we need to go offer sacrifices, and it's a 3-day journey from here and all this kind of stuff. Pharaoh says, well, basically just go sacrifice these animals in your land, in Goshen. And Moses said, actually, this is quite detestable to the Egyptians. If we do this thing, won't they stone us? So that's an instance of the Egyptians practicing stoning. This was a form of capital punishment. Basically, if you had some witnesses, the idea behind it would be the person that saw the witness would throw the first rock, and then everyone else would join in, so that really at the end of the day, you don't know which person was responsible for the death of the person that had committed the crime. But it's interesting, you'll see certain things transition over from the Egyptians over to the Israelites. And I think part of that is we have to understand the first 5 books of the Bible were written by an Egyptian, meaning Moses was raised an Egyptian. He was a Hebrew. He's from the tribe of Levi, but he was raised an Egyptian, meaning he was educated in Egyptian literature, sciences, if you will, philosophy, if you will, of the Egyptians. And God is trying to weed some of that stuff out of the Israelites because they've been practicing this stuff for 430 years. But you also have to understand that Moses was the cream of the crop. He had the best education. So he knew how to put all this stuff together when God is speaking to him on Mount Sinai. So it's just kind of interesting, right? Yeah. Joseph is quite a fascinating story when you think about it from the perspective that he actually saved the whole nation. So let's just jump back into Leviticus 4. And again, my goal is to try and see if we can glean some stuff off of Leviticus and try and see if we can actually get through this whole book here. So again, we have more sacrifices happening here. Burn all the fat on the altar, and you'll see a pattern. This pattern will show up again and again. I'm just going to flip over. I'm going to flip over here. That way you guys can see what I'm reading here. So we're on Leviticus 4. And if any one of the common people sin through ignorance, we'll talk about this basically. The idea behind this is it's like today. There are sometimes you do things and you're like, oh man, I realized I just did something wrong. Once you realize it, or once someone shares with you and goes, hey, what you did was wrong, then you are to come before the Lord with your sacrifice. And the idea is so that you can have a functioning society. And the priest shall take of the blood with his finger upon the horns of the altar of burnt offering, and shall pour out all the blood thereof at the bottom of the altar. So the blood is being drained from this animal, and he dips it with his finger and puts it upon the horns of the altar. So there's 4 horns, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. When Israel gets scattered, they get scattered to the 4 corners of the earth. And I think there's a little bit of symbolism here going on. And he shall take away all the fat thereof from off the sacrifice with peace offerings, and the peace shall be burnt. And the priest shall burn it upon the altar for a sweet savor unto the Lord, and the priest shall make an atonement for him. So these are people that remember, oh man, I messed up, so I'm going to come. We're not talking about capital punishment offenses like murdering, committing adultery, all this kind of stuff. This is stuff that they're like, oh man, I borrowed something from someone. I promised them that I would give it back to them or whatever, and I didn't do it. So I'm going to go and offer an animal for that, and then I'm going to go and make restoration to people, to whoever I offended. So let's just skip down. So there are patterns definitely going on here. Let's go to Leviticus 5. And if a soul sin and hear the voice of swearing, it is a witness, whether he has seen or known of it, he do not utter it, then he shall bear his iniquity. So what's going on here? What are we talking about here? So swearing, let's talk about swearing and vows and all this kind of stuff, because this is kind of important. So yeah, JT, we're trying to stick with Leviticus here. Maybe I'll do a Bible study on Joseph, but right now we're just focusing on going through Leviticus. And so what are vows? What are swearing? So basically the idea behind a swearing is if you make a commitment if you make a commitment with someone and you're like, hey, I am borrowing something from you and I'm going to give it back to you. I swear I will deliver it to you by tomorrow. And you don't do it, then you are basically, obviously, you're lying and you're building mistrust and all this kind of stuff. And this is what swearing is you are to do what you say. That's the idea behind this, is you want a nation of people that are telling the truth at the end of the day. And it's kind of interesting that this is how we are today, is we're to live our lives in a truthful manner. This is how we're supposed to conduct our lives. And the same thing is for Israel. So it's very similar when you think about it. So that's what is meant by swearing, is basically telling the truth and fulfilling your obligation. So if you have a vow and you promise something, you're to fulfill that promise before the sun goes down. That's the idea behind it. And it's very important. And we'll talk about vows at the end of Leviticus 27, and what that all means. So again, the way that I look at Leviticus and the way I give like a 10,000 foot view is I look at the Leviticus as a church, as a hospital, and as a bank. And perhaps I'll make a couple of videos explaining that a little bit more. But what we're trying to do is just go through the entire book of Leviticus and see if we can come up with some thoughts that maybe we never thought about. So yeah, so let's just jump back to Leviticus. Yeah, hey Nikki, thanks for that. Appreciate that. Yeah, like I used to avoid, pardon the pun, I used to avoid Leviticus like the plague. So I used to think, oh man, there's so much blood and gore in it, so much blood and gore. So I'm trying to read it also from the perspective of a woman reading this book, because really most women just skip over the bloody stuff. If there's battles and war and guts and glory and all that, you kind of skip over that. And I think most Christians skip over a lot of this stuff. And sometimes we have to do a bit of a deep dive and go, okay, what's going on here? What's happening here? All right, so and if a soul sin and hear the voice of swearing and is a witness, so if he heard someone promise something and he knows of it and he doesn't say anything, then he shall bear his iniquity. Meaning, if you hear someone make a promise and they're going to do it and they don't do it, and you don't intervene and say, look, dude, I heard you yesterday. You promised this guy that you would pay him his wages and you didn't do it. You didn't honor what you said. You're a liar. So take care of that. Or if a soul touch any unclean thing, whether it be a carcass of an unclean beast, or a carcass of an unclean cattle, or a carcass of an unclean creeping things, and if it be hidden from him, he shall also be unclean and guilty. Till when? Usually till the evening, or usually until it comes to his remembrance. So sometimes you might come across a beast or a carcass of an unclean cattle. Maybe it's a camel, maybe it's something that's dead, diseased, whatever, and you're like, I got to move this thing off the road. I got to get rid of this thing. Got to burn it or whatever it is. You're now considered unclean until you do basically a ritual cleansing, if you will. You have to go to the priest, and I'm going to share this a little bit later, but basically you clean your clothing, you wash your hands, all this kind of stuff, because you don't know what you touch. You don't know if it's diseased, whatever is involved in it. So you have to clean yourself up, basically. And I think that's common sense today. Like you just don't go and touch dead animals on the road, because you don't know what kind of a disease that they have. And this is why if an animal's struck by a vehicle or whatever on the road, you can choose if you want to remove the animal from the road, but usually people will grab a pair of gloves or something, and then, or a bag or whatever it is, and move it to the side of the road in order to protect their skin from this animal, because again, you don't know what kind of an animal, what kind of disease it has, or anything. The best thing is to just call the proper authorities because they know how to dispose of this animal. Most times I'll just pull it off to the side and let the animals, the wolves or whatever, take care of it, the fowls of the air, and clean up the mess. But this is the idea behind this, because you got to think about it from in the terms of moving into a foreign nation, which is the land of Canaan. And we'll get into this a little bit, but basically if you're thinking about it from the context of not getting sick, you don't want to be touching a dead animal and then putting your fingers in your eyes and in your mouth and whatever, and like nothing happened. You want to be able to clean yourself up. So when they're talking about, or when Moses writes about the idea of moving into a new land, which is going to take place 40 years, but the idea was they would basically be moving into that land right away. But because of the spies coming back with a bad report, they had to wait 40 years. So if you can imagine going into a land and you're actually taking over people's homes, you're not building, they're already built. These homes are already built. You're occupying that land because Israel basically drove these people out of the land and took over their land, their crops, everything there, because they were growing stuff. They had buildings built. To lag. So is that on my side there's lag, or is it on your side? There's a bit of a lag. I think the lag will go away if once I'm done this live stream. I think you can watch it after. So I don't know if it's on my side or your side. Where was I? Yeah, so they're moving into a land and they're occupying buildings. And imagine if some of these buildings had people that were that had dedicated their firstborn into the foundation of the walls, if you will. So some of these walls were infected with not only dead bodies, but were probably dealing with mold, mildew, all this kind of stuff because they had been abandoned. And so now you have Israelites living in some of these homes. And the idea is if you saw mold on a wall, that you would call the priests, and the priests would come in and check it out, because they're also, remember, this is not just a church, but it's also a hospital, and it's also a bank. But you can also say that these are basically like construction engineers, if you will. They understand the foundations of how things are being built, because obviously they built cities for Pharaoh. So when they come into these homes, they're like, wow, it looks like there's mold on the plaster of one of these homes. And the priest would check it out, would inspect it, and then go, well, let's scrape off the plaster and then we'll replaster it. But we got to scrape it off and we'll leave it for a week. And then we'll come back. So you leave the home for a week, come back in a week. And if the mold is back, then that tells you this is basically a spreading molding, if you will. And you need to basically plow this whole home. It needs to come down, and you need to destroy it because it's a spreading mold, and it's going to encompass the whole home, and it's not safe for you to live here. Whether that's dead bodies in the foundation, don't know. Could have been dead animals lying around before the Israelites came into that home, don't know. And the foundation could have been a little bit rocky, if you will, where it's not done properly, it's not done by code, and then they would just destroy that complete building. Most times, though, just the removing of the plaster and seeing, okay, all the mold is gone, they remove that plaster, take it outside the camp and burn it, get rid of it. Then they can go back and plaster, basically paint the wall, all this kind of stuff, and you're good. You still got a good home. But this would happen also with clothing. So if they would have mold or mildew on some of their articles of clothing, whether it would be skin, because sometimes they would wear layers of clothing, some would be fur, some would be skin. And if it had a hint of mold on it, then they were to bring that to the priest. The priest would check it out and go, yeah, this, let's just wash this, see what happens. So they would wash it, dry it, and then and then come back and visit it a week later. And if the mold had spread, then they are to burn all that clothing. Why? It's to protect the people. Sometimes just a simple washing would get rid of that mold, would get rid of it, whatever type of mold that would be. But you would do that with clothing. You would do that with buildings. If animals were sick or lame, whatever, you put them obviously out of their misery, all this kind of stuff. And the idea is you're not eating these animals that were sick, because again, that could cause you to get sick as well as a nation. And then things would be spreading into the nation. So these are what Moses is writing down for the Israelites when they move into a new nation, because otherwise they're going to get sick, because they're going to get contaminated by touching dead things that you don't know how long they've been dead there. You don't know what they are. And there were all kinds of diseases, because remember, there was incest going on. There was people having sex with animals and killing animals and just leaving them along the side of the road. You don't know if that was a sacrifice. You have no idea. So you don't touch the animal. You tell the priest, and the priest would come and remove those animals. You don't know what kind of a country you're moving into, because remember, the land was vomiting these people out of it. And this is why Israel was moving into that land, was to basically pronounce judgment on all the people that actually lived in that land. So yeah, it's kind of interesting that their Israelite was not used because they were righteous, but they were used because they were obedient to God to go into this land. And the basically the wickedness of the Amorites had made it to the ceiling. This is why God brought Israel into that land. And we see later that Israel actually begins to be curious about all the gods that were in their land before them, and wanted to understand how they worked and all this kind of stuff. And so eventually got to a point where there were so many gods that Israel was worshiping that God had to use an outside source to come in and punish Israel, aka the Syrians, aka the Babylonians will come in to that land. So that's what God uses, is other nations to judge other nations, not because they're righteous, but because the wickedness has come to a ceiling where God has to deal with it. So at least this is what was going on back in the Old Testament. This is why Israel was moving into that land, was because of some promises that were made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as well. Don't forget about that. All right, let's go back. We're on Leviticus 5. We are just cooking through. We are cooking through here. Touch any unclean. If he touch the uncleanness of a man, whatever uncleanness it be, that a man shall be defiled withal, it should be hid from him. When he knoweth of it, then he shall be guilty. Or if a soul swear, pronouncing with his lips to do evil or to do good, whatever it be, that a man shall pronounce with an oath, and it be hid from him, when he knoweth of it, then he shall be guilty in any one of these. And when he shall be guilty in one of these, he shall confess that he has sinned in that thing. And then he brings a trespass offering from the flock, which is a lamb or a kid of the goats. So a lamb of the sheep, the flock, if you will, or a kid of the goats. So, and it has to be a female. So this is kind of interesting as well. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about this. So it has to be, if someone has a guilty conscience, if you will, they're like, oh man, this sucks. I remembered I made a promise, whether good or bad, and I remembered what I did. Now I'm going to bring this female lamb or a female kid of the goats. So a female lamb, obviously, of the flock, or a female kid of the goats for a sin offering. and the priest shall make an atonement. And if he can't afford it, if he can't bring a lamb, then he shall bring 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons unto the Lord. So it's interesting that that we have females now being used. So the reason why this is important, oh, I didn't show the verse. Okay, that's all right. The reason why this is important is this was basically the easiest way to look at Leviticus would be to look at things as fines, if you will. So bringing a female lamb that is young or a female goat, if you're bringing it because you did something dumb, you made a vow, whether good or bad, and you remember what you did, now you're obligated to bring that female lamb or female goat to the priest, and they sacrifice it on your behalf, and it's done. You're forgiven. But if you only have 2 lambs and 2 goats, and you have a male and you have a female lamb and you have a male and a female goat, you've just lost one of your females of the flock, or you just lost one of your females of the goat. So now what happens? You only have a male. Well, you have to now go to some other person that has more than one female lamb. Why? Because you're not going to eat this winter, because your animals aren't breeding now because you only have males. So if you have a friend over for coffee, maybe that friend decided to buy some Tim Hortons coffee, because that's what I feel like doing right now, is having a Tim Hortons coffee and some donuts, and they bring it over to your house, and maybe you invite that person to stay for lunch, and they're like, oh yeah, I'd love to stay for lunch, that'd be kind of cool. And then you're like, oh wait, sorry, I can't invite you for lunch because I'm down to one male of the flock, one male sheep, if you will, and I only have one male goat. Your friend would be like, what's going on with you? What's going on in your life? Well, I messed up. I did something that I shouldn't have done. And then once I remembered it, I gave away my only female lamb. So now I have to go out and I have to buy another female lamb to replace the one that I lost because I messed up. So this is going to hit the pocketbook. This is going to hit your bank account hard. Why? Because you won't be able to have food. You won't be able to have clothing. And people are not going to trust you when they walk by your herd and they see, oh, look at this guy. He's got no females. This guy's doing something crazy. Or they look over at the goats and they're like, he's got no females there. This guy's messing up. So imagine every field you go to and there's no females of sheep left, because this is what normal people were responsible for bringing to the priests, was their female lambs, their female goats, either one of those, not male. They weren't supposed to bring the male lambs. They're not supposed to bring male goats. Why? That's what the leaders bring. The leaders bring the male goats or the male lambs. So if you have an officer or someone that's in charge of your district or your area and they mess up and they don't have any male goats or lambs and you're messing up, maybe your town is messing up, you have to sacrifice females only. You're not allowed to bring a male goat. All right. Let me move this here. Can you hear me? I something. There. Cool. This sounds weird now. This is horrible. I got kicked out of my Mac Pro, so I'll probably have to end this session because my Mac Pro ran out of power, so I'm on my cell phone. Let me see if I can fix this. Give me 1 second. How's that? Still an echo. That work? It's even worse. Last test. No, it's not working. All right, guys. So I'm going to have to cancel this live stream and continue. Perhaps when I get back to my other computer, we'll continue with Leviticus because this is quite annoying. Not sure why I'm getting that. All right. Anyways, sorry about that, guys. We'll try this again later. Thanks a lot for watching. See you later.